All right. Coffee topic this morning is going to be brought to you by Mr. Drew Hinton from Aero Safety. You're all familiar in the community with Drew. Thank you, Drew, for doing this. And
Absolutely.
you've got an electrical safety topic, don't you?
Yeah. As you and I were discussing offline, we do lots, not just my company, myself as well. We do a lot of electrical training, and there's a lot of just misconceptions out there, mainly around the topic of, or the term of qualified person, right? So if we're having somebody go out and do electrical work, what is that qualified person? Because we teach 70E, which if you're not familiar, if you haven't dealt with LZL, haven't dealt much with OSHA versus NFPA 70E, it's not legally enforceable, but it's kind of seen as the gold standard for electrical safety in the workplace. But their definition is very similar to OSHA's. It just says a qualified person is somebody who is received. It's a two-part definition. So first part is receive safety training to assess and identify hazards, risk, and appropriately mitigate those. But the second part is that they've demonstrated the knowledge or skills related to that specific topic, project, equipment, whatever it is. And that's what we see a lot of really misunderstandings. People, electrical companies have been doing this stuff for many, many years, or new folks as well, because they don't understand that demonstration portion of it, right? So they've put them through a training. Let's say they put them through our training. We always have a disclaimer and says, look, I'm not the one that can designate you as a qualified person. This is just giving you the second part of that definition, or what I just explained the first part. Like, we're telling you the safety hazards and risk mitigation methods. Like, your employer has to designate you after seeing you or understanding that you've demonstrated those skills and knowledge. But so they sometimes incorrectly understand that terminology, and they're throwing people out there to do work that they got a master electrician license. Doesn't always mean that you're qualified. The big issue, or not really a big issue per se, is like the big separation is that qualified is very specific to a topic, project, piece of equipment. Like, I may be qualified to go, some people say low voltage versus high voltage, or qualified to go work on a 480 volt disconnect, but not qualified to go work on an MCC bucket, whatever it may be. So it opens a lot of gray areas for employers.
So you have to be very specific about the area you're qualified to work in and oversee.
Yeah, and I'll give you an example of, we've got a customer, I'm not going to name their name, but they do great work, and they've got some capacitors, which if anybody that's followed NFPA 7Es knows that's a new-ish that came out in the previous 2021 edition of standard. It was a capacitor section, which a lot of places have capacitors, but this customer specifically, when they've got a component as part of their product, I'll just say product, they got a component that capacitor, when it fails, they replace the whole component. They don't break down the capacitor or work on it, discharge it, and stuff. So they're qualified to do that. And we've had this discussion with them because we do a lot of work with this customer, but they're not qualified. If they, I was like, do y'all ever work on these capacitors, discharge them, use grounding sticks and that stuff? He said, nope, we don't mess with it. We're not trained to do that stuff. We just replace the entire module essentially, and don't individually get to the capacitor itself.
So the minute they open that capacitor and start to troubleshoot or diagnose or like mess around with it, tinker with it, they've gone out of the scope of their capabilities for that definition of being qualified.
Yeah, because they can, obviously they can diagnose and say, okay, the capacitor's failed, but they're not going to take the capacitor off. They're not going to do any repairs to the capacitor, because that's one of the capacitors specifically, is one that's got a lot of special hazards that you typically don't see with typical, I say kind of typical electrical work. Is you've got two new boundaries that you don't see on regular electrical work. You got a hearing protection boundary, which I say you can potentially get in a hearing protection boundary with proper hearing protection, but they've also got a lung protection boundary, which means you got a 1% probability of lung collapse from that, which the energy associated with that's 122,000 joules. Nobody can ever go in that boundary. So there's a lot of special stipulation, but they recognize, look, we're not qualified to do any individual repairs, so we're just going to replace the entire module. Now,
Makes sense. It's safer.
Yeah. But that demonstration, it's whenever the employer verifies that you've demonstrated those skills. So I could, let's say somebody came and let's say Aero Safety was doing electrical work. I could watch one of my employees do the work and see they've done it safely, properly, follow the right protocols, all that stuff, and I could then deem them qualified, but I can also send them out to, let's say, I can send out that capacitor manufacturer to take a specialized course just on that stuff from the manufacturer. And as long as I review the course outline and all that stuff to see what they covered, it doesn't have to be me providing that demonstration. I can just say, okay, I saw what they covered in that class. Now we're going to deem you qualified to work on that.
So you're sort of farming out giving them the knowledge and education needed for that scope of work.
Yeah.
You're pointing to that as, yes, this qualifies them.
Yeah. And I think that just the big issue is a lot of people see that, they come to, any training provider and say, we're going to take a 70E and FPA 70E course. And now it automatically deems them qualified, but it's not the case, right? So, the employer, it's just like with a competent person for fall protection or any other thing else. I can't say you're competent as a third party. That's got to be up to the employer to say, hey, we feel that you're competent based on your training you've been through, experience, whatever it is. We feel that we're going to designate you as a competent person. Same thing applies here. Like I said, they can go through a 70E course or any electrical course, and they say, okay, they're qualified, and it's not always necessarily true.
There you go. All right. Got to watch out for those definitions of terms,
That's right.
man.
They're tricky.
Yeah, they can be. They can be. All right. Thanks for joining us on this coffee topic, Drew. And everybody, watch out for Drew's latest episode with us where we talked about Kentucky OSHA dialing back to federal standards for private employers. And it's a good discussion. It's worth giving it a listen. All right. Thanks, Drew.
All right. Perfect. Appreciate it.